Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. We're missing Adrian and Cassidy, who's replacing Salma B. Adrian is the former head coach of the Irish national rowing team. An interesting case study of how religion plays out in competitive sport, particularly sectarianism. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it on behalf of the Wolf Institute, and I will speak on behalf of the Center for Islamic Studies. My name is Shana Cohen, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute. And I'm not going to spend a long time introducing, particularly since we started late. I just wanted to point out two other Festival of Ideas events. First, Center for Islamic Studies, there's an event on October 29th on Wednesday from 6 to 8 p.m. called The Canary in the Mine, Islam, the Challenge of Modern Art, and that's in King's College, in the King's Lecture Theater. And then we have an event called Faith and National Identity today, and that's with Ed Kessler, who's in the audience, and Sugar Ahmed, who also works for the Institute, and that is October 30th at 5:30 in the Healy Room at Westminster College. So, again, I won't spend too much time doing this. I want to thank you very much for coming. We'll be hopefully joined in a few minutes by someone else. I would just introduce Professor Michael Berkowitz, who will talk about boxing, and then Omar Salha, who's a PhD student at SOAS, who's doing his research, where he'll explain it to you, on Islamic diplomacy and non-Muslims in sport. Muslims and non-Muslims in sport, thank you very much. And Mahfoud Amara, who's from Loughborough University, whose work has been on football in Algeria, but who can broaden it up for you. And then Adrian, again, as I told you, is a professional athlete, a rower. Okay, so I won't spend, are you going?
No, of course.
Okay, so I'm going to get just used to the technology. So we'll give these to you. Okay. Let's go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation, and really pleased to be here and to talk about sport and religion. It's not a topic that we usually, talk about. So it's my work. I've been working on sports in Muslim context. What I mean by Muslim context, I looked at sport in Islam, so in relation to the Islamic discourse about sport from a theoretical point of view, and sports in Muslim countries. So when you say Muslim countries, there are different, cultures, different ethnic groups. So it's not one homogeneous block. So I wanted to find out what are the diverse ways of defining sports and sport practices in those different Muslim countries in North Africa, Middle East, but in other parts of the world. And also there is the topic around sport and Islamism or political Islam. So I make the distinction between Islam, the way it is practiced, it is as a belief system, and political Islam as a political ideology. So I looked at how political parties, particularly Islamist parties, define and engage with sports, seen as being a product of Western modernity or as external to the Muslim cultures. The other topic is around sport and Muslim communities in Europe. So particularly with regards to Muslims being a minority group in a non-Muslim majority. So how they engage with sports in terms in relation to, then there is the questions of integration, assimilation to Western culture. Sometimes Muslim communities are being judged on their likelihood to integrate Muslim cultures based on their integration or acceptance of sporting Western, dominant sporting practices. So those are the areas that I looked at in my work, and so I'm happy as well to answer any questions around those issues.
Thank you.
Thank you
you very much. Yes, I also want to say thank you to the Wolf Institute and for inviting me on to be part of the Festival of Ideas. Actually, a colleague of mine is also at SOAS, who is at Wolf Institute, Mohammed Abdulaziz. So we are actually on a project at SOAS looking at the integration of Muslims in the UK as part of the Mahfoud Trust. So of course my thanks goes out to the Mahfoud Trust for actually getting us on this scholarship of study. A bit about my research study. The title is Islamic Diplomacy and Ethics, Relations between Muslims and Non-Muslims in Sport. And I would say the inspiration began back in 2011, where actually I was a member, and still am a member of Football Beyond Borders, which is a student-led organization which we traveled to the Middle East. Embarking on that trip, it was very interesting to see the social intricacies between players and also the locals using sport as a medium to connect with different peoples, transcending cultural barriers and language and faith, of course. Of course, the political implications happening during that year with the Egyptian revolution, and as ever, the political sensitivities in Israel-Palestine. And of course, with reference to Jordan, which was our last leg of the tour, it was interesting to see how political identity was formed through sports, and actually in particular through football. There's a local, I say, football club called Al-Wahdat, and on the emblem of this football team is actually the Dome of the Rock in Palestine, and they're one of the most, arguably the most successful Arab football teams in the region. So my scope is actually to look at how can sport be a tool of diplomacy and actually allow better integration for Muslims in this country through this medium. I'm particularly focusing on Muslim athletes in football. So I'm looking at Muslim football players, particularly in the Premier League, and I argue for that case why. I'm interested in symbolic power, which is ever evident in religious expressions and in and off the field, particularly with players who are prostrating after a goal celebration or who raise their hand before a football match in prayer. Of course, not to exclusively say it's only Muslims who do this. Of course, in my research, I am arguing the Muslim case, but of course there are many other cases where there are people who are doing it for religious reasons and other obviously political reasons, cultural reasons as well, which manifest in the understanding of symbolic power and capital. So it's interesting for me to look at it from that perspective, and how does that form of power, of symbolism and symbolic capital actually translates into recognition, or the aim of attaining recognition, and allowing others to raise a sort of an Islamic sport identity, Islamic British identity in sport, which takes into account their heritage and their faith in the beautiful game, as we say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've mostly worked on boxing, and boxing is a very interesting area historically, and I'd say you really can't imagine the sport developing as it does without looking at its particularly ethnic and religious dimensions, although I'd say that they really play out in different ways, and it is sometimes not quite what it seems. But let me just say at the outset that there's now a very good book on Jews in sport, really the most thorough study we've ever had, by David D., who's at De Montfort University, and he's building on the work of Dick Collins and Holt, who I'd say sort of toiled in the wilderness for years in writing about minorities in sport, and in particular anti-Semitism in sport. And it sounds terrible, but nobody wanted to listen to them. And when I first came here in '97, and I said I was interested in Jews in boxing, wow, I might as well have been talking to the wall. I mean, this is not something that anybody really wanted to talk about. But this is a huge subject in terms of boxing. Is from the late 18th century until I'd say the 1950s or even 60s. The boxing world here is simply loaded with Jews. And a lot of people say, oh no, but it's only the lowest weight divisions. Well, that wasn't that wasn't quite true. You really can't imagine boxing without people like Daniel Mendoza, Amy Belasco, Dutch Sam, then later on Kid Lewis, Kid Berg, and they also played a very, very big part in the emergence of the kind of Jewish identity that did emerge in this country, and they very much played off of others who were other. That is, those who were, say, of such different groups as blacks and Irish. And very interestingly, even early on, they figured out ways to sort of use and deploy the way that they were perceived and ethnic identity or racial identity in order to help create reputations for themselves and sort of increase the gauge and all sorts of things. But what I wanted to say is that I think a way that it's been understood by some scholars, I've had a lot of problems with it. Just to give you an example, in the American case, a lot of people talk about ethnic succession, that there are certain groups at certain times, and then other groups simply succeed them. And I'd say it's been argued to a lesser extent in this country, and with all due respect, I think this isn't a very good explanation, because it isn't simply that groups succeed other groups naturally. I think that there's a lot more politics and a lot more choice and a lot more other factors that very often we don't often see. And just to give you an example, people think that, oh, Jews left boxing because of the other groups coming in. There were other ethnic groups that came in. I found, the more I looked into this, that this was very problematic. I think Jews really left boxing in great numbers in the mid-1930s, around the time of the Berlin Olympics, that is the Nazi Olympics, when Jews faced a possibility of being the very best in their sport, but not being able to compete because of the political reason. For me, it took me a long time to figure this out, but I think this is really where the huge drop-off, particularly in boxing and in other sports that were mainly Olympic sports or had great Olympic forums, came from. That is, this is where a lot of Jews actually gave up on sport as something that they were very passionately committed to. So I think that we have a couple of questions. We have a spectrum that is, in society generally, are you going to be interested or committed to sport, or are you not? And so people make this choice, and a lot of times this depends on their social situation. And also, there's the idea of, well, what sport are you going to be committed to? And I think this also is a lot more complicated. And just to say something about boxing, one of the reasons why we just don't have the same kind of athletes and don't have the same kind of African-American athletes in boxing that we have is the kind of people who would have become boxers years ago now become linemen in American football. That is, if you're huge, if you're really big, if you're really strong, if you're fast, if you're coordinated, you can get a college scholarship. And say in terms of the kinds of choices that people make in sport, I think that a lot of times this figures in. We have now very, very relatively few African Americans in American baseball. Is this because they can't play the sport? No, it's a matter of the kind of choices that are made at certain points in life. So I think that almost all of this has to be looked at a lot more carefully in terms of what is going on at different levels in sport. And I think one of the reasons why the work of David D. and others is so valuable is because they show that at certain points, contrary to the stereotype, there are actually very large numbers of Jews in different sports who are doing extremely well. And the reasons why they come and go are actually quite complicated. Now, one of the things I'll say, which doesn't sound so nice, in a lot of ways, you'd say they wouldn't have become what they were if not for their religious identity. But on the other hand, the religious identity itself is very often in sport an affectation or a matter of play acting. That is, you can be very sincere and then you can be not so sincere. It can be simply something you do, literally going through the motions. Jews in boxing was very interesting. It became sort of a great trick to come out into the ring covered with a talit, with a prayer shawl, and maybe even tefillin. Again, and people said, oh, they're very religious. This is complete crap. They weren't very religious at all. It was great play acting. It was wonderful, which is not to say that religious sensibilities aren't important or different religious groups aren't important. And I'd say that you can't begin to understand the world of boxing in the United States or in Britain without the central figure of Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali, I think, probably would have been the very first person to say that of course you can't begin to understand this without looking at Jews and other groups. Now I'll show you something that might seem a little bit funny. I did this book in 2007 with my dear colleague Ruti Unger. It's the best book that exists on minority fighters in Britain. It's the only book that exists on minority fighters in Britain. It's on Jewish and black boxers in Britain, and my wife, being a very smart person, said, "Why is Amir Khan in here? He is neither Jewish nor black. You know, why is he in here?" And I said, well, you know, interestingly, he had no problem being in this book. Not only had no problem being in this book, he had no problem giving us photographs for free, not charging all, being thrilled to be included. Why? Because he, being a smart person, realizes that he is part of a culture where there has always been this multicultural aspect. He has no, so there isn't anything that's problematic about it to him. Nobody had to explain it to him. And also, the other person who was incredibly generous to us was Lennox Lewis. Again, nobody had to sit down and say, gee, there's this long history of Jews in boxing, and that helped with, you know, there being black people involved, and Irish and Italians. Again, when you're inside it, or if you sort of any kind of sensibility of the history, and I will say this about boxing, it is one of the more historically minded, although brutal, sports imaginable and criticized for all sorts of good reasons. But I think the historical aspect, and also there is, which is not to say that there isn't racism and all that, but there is a very deeply held fraternal aspect in boxing that I think, and you can say, well, it's because I used to fight myself, but I think it probably runs a lot deeper than a lot of other sports. This idea of the way that people within this realm treat each other, which again is simply doesn't translate in the same way in other places.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do you mind if I take the,
Sure, please. Sorry.
That's okay.
All yours.
Adrian.
Very sorry I'm late.
That's okay. So, Adrian will finish off for us. Just click onto your shirt. So, Adrian is going to talk to us about a totally different sport, and as a professional athlete, about rowing.
Okay, so my background was I was originally started rowing when I was a teenager, and then became international athlete through that, rowed at university, rowed for my country, and then became a professional rowing coach. And in the UK it's quite straightforward, it's generally quite middle class, I suppose traditionally, public school, that kind of thing. But then when I was in Cambridge in 2001, there was funding made available for a talent identification program, where we went to all the schools in 16 different countries around the UK, tested all 14, 15-year-old boys who were of a certain height, so there was a certain cut-off. And we picked kids, and we ran these camps. We had camps 10 times a year, so 10 weekends a year. We get all the kids from around the country, 200 kids together. We do these testing weekends. We bash them against each other and come through. And as a consequence of 2012, about 15% of the medalists came from Town ID. And that's why British rowing became the best rowing nation, because that filled the gap. What it did do is completely open up to other groups of people that normally would not have had the opportunity. And one case in point is Mohammed Spihi, who's now a world Olympic medalist and a world champion twice over. And he's strictly Muslim. And he's from Morocco originally, his family's originally from Morocco, but he's British. He is very devout, and when I was coaching him as a junior, London 2012 was on his horizon. This was 2007. And he was already, because he would do Ramadan during training. He would train twice a day and practice Ramadan. And he would never make a fuss of it, wouldn't have a go at anybody, wouldn't mention it, just got on with it. But during 2012, Ramadan fell during the Olympic Games. And he was concerned, well, how would I going to manage this kind of thing? And we had to discuss. And as it turned out, a lot of the Muslim athletes got special dispensation from the imams to perform, and then they have to do extra duties and extra time afterwards. But it's something he was very clear about, that's what he did, but it was no big song and dance, and nobody made any judgments about him because of it. He was just another guy in the team doing his job. Then, for the last 4 years, in the run up to London 2012, I was actually in charge of the Irish rowing team, which has its own Protestant Catholic conflicts that go on. And I suppose the flag is the interesting thing that the athletes, most of them are based in Southern Ireland, the Republic, but actually sports are divided between Republic of Ireland sports and Northern Ireland sports, like football, for instance, and hockey. They're different, they're separate. But rowing, like boxing, is an all-Ireland sport. So the Northern Irish people compete for Ireland. So, for example, we had a national rowing centre which was set up in Cork. €7 million have been spent on it. It was sort of the remnant of the Celtic Tiger, all the money that in the world was available. So we're setting it up, and some of the athletes who are based in the south wanted to put the tricolour up in the gym because it's their home, it's the way they train. They want to feel passionate about what they do. In principle, there was no problem with it. But one of our coaches, who was from Northern Ireland, he said, "We can't really do that." And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because nothing wrong with it, but the odd person from the north who would come down might get really upset. This is up." Which is kind of ironic, because when the Northern Irish athletes go to the Olympic Games, there's yellow in the kit, which is the Protestant yellow, orange. And if they win a medal, they'll happily wrap the tricolour around themselves, regardless, and they'll feel passionately Irish. But yet, if you put a flag up in the gym during training, somebody might get upset. So you have to play this delicate balance between what is acceptable, what isn't, and really cater for people's sensibilities. And one of the interesting ones is the rugby, because that's also an all-Ireland sport. And the Irish Union have their own flag with the 4 provinces on it and the Irish Rugby Union emblem. But when they walk into the stadium, they all wear the tricolour, they'll carry the tricolour and the Rugby Union flag. But they won't carry the tricolour if they play a home game in Ulster. They will play if they do it in Dublin, which is where they play most of their home games. So it's a really difficult balance. But it's not just about religion, it's not just Protestant Catholic, I think it's much deeper than that.
Thank you very much. I would like to open it up for questions, but I was going to start, take advantage of being the chair, and start with a question for you, Omar. You asked the question, you posed it, how can sport be a tool for diplomacy? So I was going to turn it back to you and ask how you think sport can be a tool for diplomacy. And that, to give you an example, sort of Pope Francis's interfaith football game, what kind of impact do you think something like that could have? Do you want to take the questions in groups of 3, or do you want to answer them?
I don't mind.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, if you don't mind.
Very good question, and that question is probably serves me right to answer that question after my PhD. Still early stages now. It's like sorting world peace. There isn't really. I guess there's twofold to look at it. From my early studies, what I found out is sport can be used as a site for struggle, and sport can be used as a site of hope as well, or space of hope for integration. So, I mean, with respect to the site of struggle, I would say, sport is no, I've seen this come up a lot of times, sport is no panacea for social problems. So a form for diplomacy, again, sport is arguably under the umbrella of public diplomacy. So again, with the arts, the music, etc. But in particular with diplomacy itself, the very definition of a diplomat is changing as technology is becoming much more innovative. So everyone here has the capacity to be a diplomat, to be able to be a communicator or a mediator, which is essentially what a diplomat does. So in terms of sport and diplomacy, we have athletes who are reach celebrity status. We have athletes who are widely followed. If we look at Cristiano Ronaldo, for instance, he has 30 million followers on Twitter, which is I think more than David Cameron by 15-fold, if I'm not mistaken. So we can't obviously deny the fact that these athletes have reached a status where they are worldwide renowned. And I think that affection between the athlete and the fans will allow the person to speak on behalf of the fans as a diplomat or as an ambassador in that sense. So I think in that sense, obviously, public perception is very, very important. We've seen governments who throw all their money at sporting mega events, the Olympics, the World Cup we've just witnessed in Brazil, and there are a lot of controversy, obviously, around Russia, the Russian bid and the Qatar bid as well. And again, I think the aim of public diplomacy is public perception of governments. So sport, in that sense, on a national level, can be used for diplomacy. Whereas, as much as that's important for me, my angle is to looking at it more as Muslim athletes within football. How can they maybe be these selfless ambassadorial roles that they've taken upon themselves, speaking on behalf of Islam in sports, and actually portray an image and trying to alleviate any of the misconceptions fans may have. But again, like I said, there is a twofold, and the reason why I say, of course, as Michael mentioned, Muhammad Ali, he used his status, as a boxer in the boxing world. He refused to go to join the draft, and that, I think, played a pivotal role in the young black African Americans looking up to Muhammad Ali, and actually seeing him as a diplomat or an ambassador on their behalf, a way of diplomacy without the capital D. So sports as a site of struggle, we look at Ahmed Mido, otherwise known as Mido, the Egyptian forward, who used to play for Tottenham, Middlesbrough, and a few other clubs. He was notoriously known actually for his signing on fees. He made more money signing on for different clubs than actually playing football. But his experience with Middlesbrough, and there's a case where he played against Newcastle Football Club, and the Newcastle fans were calling him shoe bomber. So they were quite, distinctive of his Islamic faith and attacking him for that. So that was a site for struggle for someone like me, though. Whereas a space of hope, you could look at, for instance, the likes of Frederic Canute, who is now a retired footballer, who, when he was fasting during the month of Ramadan, teammates would ask him, why are you fasting? What is Ramadan? He would pray in the changing room. There are many other cases, for instance, where, as a matter of fact, now a lot of football stadiums have actually accommodated multi-faith prayer rooms for fans and for players. There's an instance where I believe, the name has escaped me, but he used to play for Sissoko for Liverpool. And he would be the last player to leave the changing room, and the players respected that, and left him to pray, then actually joined the football match. So I guess that is a space of hope for sport, as used as a diplomatic tool to actually integrate with the team, since obviously most of you here believe sport is a team effort, even though if it's an individual aimed at sports, you have your coaches and your mentors, etc. So I would argue there are two folds to the answer. Unfortunately, from my early studies, I can't give you a much more resounding or groundbreaking analysis.
That's okay. We'll be patient for your PhD. Does someone have a question? Yes.
I've got a question for Omar. Sorry to exclude the three for the time being. Omar, just a couple of things first. This last World Cup saw lots of kind of on-pitch behaviour that seemed to suggest people praying or sort of religious kind of behaviour. But the question I want to ask you is that it's quite well documented fact that footballers are quite a kind of superstitious kind of breed. There's kind of lots of stories about players refusing to wear certain numbers, eating certain things for breakfast, doing certain routines before you go on the pitch. I'm sure it happens in other sports as well, of course. And you get lots of players who perform certain acts after they've scored. Striker for my team, Sergio Aguero, kisses various parts of his hand and wrist, which I think are tattoos of his kids or something. Mm-hmm. So, in the same way that religion kind of sometimes borrows from earlier, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, pre-Jewish sort of faiths, those kind of traditional, kind of pre-religious stuff. I wonder if the newfound sort of acceptance of religious behaviour kind of taps into some of that kind of former, kind of superstitious kind of stuff that goes on.
There's a case where Yaya Toure, also your team, where he was presented a bottle of champagne after, typically here at the English game, the man of the match award is a bottle of champagne, and he was offered the bottle a number of times. But this time was sort of it was live on Sky Sports. Needless to say, many millions watching the interview, and he was offered the bottle of champagne and he refused it. And he didn't stop there. He said, "I don't drink alcohol because I am Muslim." So that was very interesting. He could have easily, me as a researcher trying to look at it from a sort of impartial perspective, he could have easily said no thanks, taken the bottle and actually given it to his teammate who was standing with him. I think it was Julian Lescott was with him in that interview. The fact that he said, "No, I am Muslim," he is probably trying to stamp, I want to say authority, but actually try and look out for that recognition, for that acceptance from the Premier League in respect to their sort of traditional champagne ceremonial Man of the Match award. As a result of that, what's happened is, if you've realized, the Man of the Match award now is actually a trophy. So they've actually completely changed that. So we're looking at it from an institutional level now, where the FA and the Premier League has actually accepted the fact that we have many Muslims now playing in the Premier League, but also these Muslim players can actually win Man of the Match awards. So they're not only just players, but they're quite influential players, and players that can actually provide to be like Yaya was for you last season, a very influential player. So I don't want to generalize, of course, in research we are shot down for that. I mean, superstitions do exist. Human beings, sport, no sport, football, not football, boxing, etc. They do exist. But I don't want to sort of laud all the efforts of these players, be it Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, etc., and say that as a result of their religious beliefs, they're able to practice these acts of symbolism. Again, I think Michael's point was very, very important. I think the fact that the intention is quite sincere. There are a lot of players who actually, do raise their hands and pray and prostrate after a goal. But, if you know them on a personal level, they're actually not practicing Muslims. And the case, I don't want to mention any names, but there are players who may be perceived as practicing because they prostrate after a goal, but actually are seen out and about in a nightclub, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, like Wayne Rooney, on the unfortunate occasions when he scores, he puts his fingers up to the sky and looks up, and I think someone asked him if he was praying, and he said no, it's for his dead granddad. So it's kind of like religious symbolism, but being used in for sort of pre-religious behaviour, isn't it? Really, more kind of.
It is, and the same with Frank Lampard as well. Since his mother passed away, he points to. Again, I mean,
it seems there's a propensity within football, particularly, to accept those kind of behaviours on the pitch. It's sort of part of it, isn't it? I wonder if it feeds into or is underpinned by the propensity to enjoy that kind of ritualistic behaviour, just away from religion entirely, and just a more kind of. Including religion, of course, but an older tradition taps into.
Well, let's be frank. I mean, the Premier League spokesperson, after they obviously came out with a very short statement, as they do, about Yaya's incident and why they've changed into a Man of the Match trophy. And he very, very short words. He paraphrased. He said, look, we have many players from around the globe, and we have to accept and respect their beliefs. So I think they've actually quite realised that the Premier League now is the most watched sport, the most watched league across the globe. So I think for them it's more of a corporate decision rather than the religious sensitivity. So don't mean to sound pessimistic here, but I think that's the reality of the Premier League and the FA, the way it's run as a business, the way it ships scouting groups and clubs across East Asia, for instance, and now in Africa. So I think there's an element of we have to respect these players. They're earning a lot of money. We have to keep them happy. We have to have multi-faith prayer rooms, Ramadan they're fasting, club doctor, give them a diet that suits their needs. So I think that there's an element where I think the club has to take, the onus is on the club actually to look after their employees. If you will.
Thank you.
Someone else have a question?
I think it's both for Omar and Michael. Do you think these sort of, it's not clear whether it's superstitions or whether it's actual religious sort of signs of religious practice, but do you think these things are on the increase? That people do cross themselves more often now when they score a goal, or because I mean this famous case, of course, in America where this football player started praying. I mean, this was this set the precedent, right? It was the first time that happened, and caused an outrage, and of course, then people were very quick to point out actually, people cross themselves all the time, and that's no problem. Do you think there's a sort of an increase of this sort of behavior?
Well, I think there's been a huge increase of it. I mean, as I'm in my mid-50s, and I'd say that the sort of surge of fundamentalism all over the world is noticeable in all kinds of ways. And I'd say sort of the frequency of players crossing themselves, as they go onto the pitch is, again, I don't know, maybe somebody should count it. Just from watching games, I think it occurs much more often now than it used to. I mean, not to say it didn't exist not to say that it didn't exist before, but as far as sort of overt religious displays, and I'm again thinking of the United States as well, and this has a lot to do with the sort of Christian athlete phenomena, is that you sort of demonstrate your, you sort of demonstrate your faith. And I'm going to say one of the things that is very uncomfortable for Jews and people of other faiths in the United States is that particularly in, say, football and basketball teams, maybe even other teams, if there's something like a prayer meeting, well, gee, in America there's supposed to be a separation between church and state. To what extent is something like that legal, to actually have a prayer circle or prayer meeting? And this is a kind of thing that is being figured out in courts and other places, but on the most basic social level, it's simply not very comfortable for the kids who don't fit into it. So I think that although you can say people should be free to express themselves, it also involves in the end a matter of who's in and who's out, and it might have this aspect of exclusion. So I think that, like I said, I think it's not simply something to be welcomed that they're expressing themselves. If you do want everyone to be able to compete, then you have to figure out ways to sort of negotiate some of these things.
If I could just quickly add one. So I think there's the example of Moeen Ali, who's the English cricketer. If you see him, quite obvious he is Muslim, he has a massive beard. And in a recent interview with Mehdi Hassan in the Huffington Post, he actually was asked, so do you have people actually touch your beard and ask about your beard? Why is it you literally wear your religion on your sleeve? And he sees it as an opportunity to literally ask any questions about his faith. So not only that he is playing for his country, but it's also an opportunity that, because sport, again, going back to the fact that there's so much money being pumped into this industry. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the highest paid academic is a footballing coach in Texas. So yeah, if you're not in sport, you're doing something wrong. So if you're after a good salary in academia, definitely become a footballing coach. So there's a lot of money being put into this industry. Lower league clubs, most of their money comes from tickets from stadium, so tickets sold for fans attending the stadium. When they enter the Premier League, in particular with Hull City, 97% of their revenue comes from Sky Sports. So from their matches being televised on screen across the globe. So the fact that these players are now being put in a situation where they're heavily followed and a lot of cameras under scrutiny, but at the same time, if you mix that with someone who is actually very passionate about their faith or their beliefs or religious beliefs, etc., or even political, then they will take it as an opportunity through the attraction of sport to actually say, well, now I can actually answer these questions that people may have. For example, particularly with Moeen Ali and obviously the rise of ISIS in the region, he sees an opportunity to tell British Muslims, young British Muslims, to not follow ISIS and not to travel to Syria, for instance, because he plays for England and literally is obviously visibly Muslim. He's able to answer these questions with fans who travel with him, or colleagues even within the team. So I think if you had, let's say, asked maybe the effect, for instance, if Moeen Ali played for his university team and instead of the England national team, the effect would be far, far, far less. So I think it's an opportunity where you're in that industry where you're actually being beamed out internationally to many TV channels. So it's an opportunity for him to actually showcase his Islamic faith and his definition of his Islamic faith.
I had a question, one to Omar and one to the first speaker. I'm sorry, I didn't catch you. Mahfoud, okay. You mentioned Quranic references to sports, so I'm just wondering what kinds of references there are.
Yes, thank you for this question. From theological point of view, one can say that maybe the question of Islam and the religion is still yet to be thought. There's no, using the framework of Al-Kun, the unthinkable and the unthought in Islamic thinking. So there aren't many fatwas, around sport practice, but the main, questions are usually with regards to fasting and performance, for performance. Also in relation to the body, particularly with regards to a woman body, how it should be presented, in a public domain, and also the question of gender mixing, and the environment where sport should be practiced. What's the ideal kind of Islamic environment for sportive practice? So there are some, fatwas here and there, and forums that ask questions. Usually Muslims, athletes or non-athletes, asking imams to intervene in those in relation to sports, and with regards to boxing, also in terms of question of harming the body and the issue of doping in sports and cheating. So there are some interventions here and there, but I think they are still not being considered. Sport is considered still as a domain of amusement, and is not really an important domain right now. Taking into account other important issues that the Muslims and the Islamic world is kind of facing. Usually sports is not taken seriously by the theologians. Yeah, that's what I can say. I don't know what.
Just one comment on that is interesting. That Qatar, for instance, is a really wealthy country and it's got more oil and gas reserves than any other Middle Eastern country, and they've decided they've had enough of their best people going to Europe to be educated. They want to be able to educate their own. But also, they've decided they want to become good at sports. So forget about the World Cup, just the Aspire Academy they have in Qatar, and the number of foreigners, Austrians, that sort of thing, who end up coming and becoming citizens to compete for Qatar. And they're investing something in the region of £100 million on setting up sports development plans from childhood through to sort of basically cradle to grave, with elite performance being the middle part of it, where they try and create these pathways to get elite performance in 32 sports. So I agree it's not very much, but again, just like East Germany, sport is something that's used for political gain, not necessarily religious.
No, from a nation state's point of view and national point of view, of course there's an interest, there's a desire to be present in sporting context, but I'm talking from a theological, from theological point of view. Imams and scholars, religious scholars, they tend to be less involved in the debates around, Islam and sports. Of course, there's the question around the veil and for women, to practice sports, and so this has to, it becomes the question, with regards to Muslims practicing sports. There is a kind of emphasis about this question, and as if the whole question of Muslims practicing sport has been reduced to the question of the veil and women and gender question. So that again, for example, there was with regards to women and sports, there was the big debates in relation to the flag bearer of Iran, and she was a woman, and there have been many debates in Iran. Many questions have been asked to theologians, with regards to is it acceptable for a woman to be a flag bearer of Iran, the Iranian delegation? So again, there was some questions about the role of women as a representative of the Muslim Ummah, and how she has to behave, in such a way to be, a model, for other women. So, but there aren't many studies from, let's say, a religious point of view that specifically address the question of sports. There's a lot to write about.
Okay, thank you.
You had a second question?
Yeah, actually, the second question was to Omar, because you mentioned the Islamic sport identity in Britain, and I was just wondering, how would you describe that identity, and does it apply equally to converts you see in sports? So football, that is.
So how would I describe Islamic identity in sport?
Yeah, the specific Islamic sport identity that you mentioned. And do you actually see converts in professional football?
Yeah, there are many converts generally there are many converts, and within sport particularly, I think the co-founder of the Association of Muslim Footballers is Nathan Ellington, who used to play for Ipswich, and he converted to Islam. Ribéry, of course, as well. Elsewhere in sport generally, I believe there's the name escapes me again. In New Zealand, there's a player who's also converted to Islam. Many converts which happen within the France.
Anelka.
Yes, Nicolas Anelka. Many in France actually. But in terms of Islamic identity in sport, there's so much luggage with that. I mean, like in terms of, for me, what my research is to look at those who define themselves as Muslims. So I'm not literally, I will not go into the theology behind, do you pray 5 times a day, do you fast, do you give zakat, have you been to Hajj, do you read Quran? I am not getting myself involved in that whatsoever, because I think it's a lot, I mean, I want to say a waste of time, but I think it needs a lot of baggage for me personally. Actually, I end up finishing my PhD definitely, that's for sure. Because again, this term Islamic identity is something which many scholars for many years continue to discuss. But if very simply for me, if you define yourself as a Muslim, then you are entitled to be categorized in this Islamic identity in sport for me. And again, there are other, within now, of course, with my research, with my questioning for my field work, it will be much more interesting to see people, for example, who are also non-Muslim and how they perceive, how they take the symbolic actions from Muslim players and how they perceive them. For example, do they have any effect on non-Muslim audiences? If not, does that mean then the work of the Muslim athlete, the diplomat, has their work been hampered or not been as effective as they hoped for? So that would be interesting. But actually, for me, for my research, that would be more interesting to see non-Muslims' reaction to Demba Ba prostrating. Now, obviously, he's been shipped to Turkey. He's playing for Besiktas. But interesting to see, the likes of him, for instance, when he was prostrating. And we've seen, Newcastle fans actually chant his name and actually have a specific song for Demba Ba. About Ramadan, because he was fasting during the month of Ramadan, and this was in the BBC documentary about Muslims in the Premier League. So the fact that the BBC are doing a documentary about Muslims in the Premier League means, again, that the struggle for recognition and for awareness has been achieved to some extent through this documentary, and of course, again, through opening up these prayer rooms which are up and down the country, is another aspect of that.
This for the first speaker as well. You mentioned earlier about Islamist political parties and how they, or their agenda in terms of sports that are seen as Western, or perhaps given what you said about the theological view, just sports in general, and how they attempt to remove the Muslim population from something like that. And I was wondering if you could offer more information.
Yeah, I looked at the literature of those what they call them as Islamist parties, particularly in the Arab world and Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt, and also other Islamist parties in Algeria and Morocco. They all take into account, I mean, they acknowledge the importance of sport in society. They will not reject it. They understand that there is a desire to be, among the youth particularly to practice sports and to be fan of a football club or to consume sports. They also, for them, they would be foolish to go against this kind of important global culture. So they try to accommodate that, in relation to their own moral discourse about, trying to promote this idea of a moral way of practicing sports, and the players and the sports athletes have to be ambassadors of Islam and their Muslim nations. Also, they with regards to they engage with the debates around ethics, sports and ethics. And for them, from a political point of view, from strategically, they stadium and they attract more maybe than maybe mosques, or so they from an electoral point of view they have to tap into that big community. So that's why they wouldn't be seen as kind of rejecting completely sport practice, although they are wary about it as being kind of an import from the West and maybe a legacy of colonial history, but they wouldn't reject it just because of it's being dominated by a Western, let's say Western culture.
Can I, as a sportsman, Adrian, you're quite familiar with rugby. Is there a difference in the way that rugby players celebrate? I mean, this touches on the issue of class. Is there a difference in the way that rugby players celebrate, for example, goals as opposed to footballers?
I don't think so. I think rugby players don't. Do they just score and they hug each other and go and do the next thing? Really, I don't think there's anything particularly. I do follow rugby. It's not something I've seen as particularly obvious. And in a sport like rowing, for instance, I mean, you get guys who might cross themselves quietly in the boat before they start racing, but then nobody sees it because it's not on television. And there was a situation, my wife actually rode in the boat race here in '95, and one of her crewmates was very religious, and she hadn't said anything the whole way through the whole process, and then just before they left the changing room to go to the race, she said, would anybody like to come and sit down and pray with me? And that made some of the people in the crew feel quite uncomfortable, because it hadn't happened before. And suddenly, the most important point, suddenly she asked this, so some of them sat down and some of them didn't. And so I don't think that's a judgment on what she wants to do, but she sort of sprung it on them without preparing. Which I don't think anything to do with religion, it's just to do with an inappropriate time to bring something new in. And I read a story actually, Michael Johnson was talking about the track athletes 100 metres, before they go in, they're always in this pen waiting. They spend about an hour and a half together warming up and sitting in a room waiting to go onto the track. And it's full of mind games. You know, guys walking around topless trying to be bigger than the other guys. It's really macho environment. And so there's one competitor who, at one of the competitions, just tried to get all the athletes in this 400 metre race to sit down and pray with him. But it was a mind game. And he said, I'm not doing that, thank you very much. But other people felt uncomfortable and joined in with him. But that he felt, Michael Johnson felt that was being manipulative as a mind game, just using it as a tool. So, yeah, but in rugby I don't see it. I mean, I think the thing that struck me in Ireland, it's the same as the UK, despite we had this perception of them being really religious and all the fights between the Protestants and the Catholics. People made comments about them being Protestants from the north and, you know, all the Catholics and everything, but nobody cared. Really, nobody really cared. They just everybody got on and trained together, and because it was all performance driven, didn't matter what you did or where you came from.
Just on that point, actually, my image of Ireland sort of post-Troubles is that sport has been used for this diplomacy that we were talking about earlier. Is that true? Is that something you've had experience of at all?
I mean, the thing with the Irish and the two flags, actually that happened in 1932. So, it was instigated by they wanted to go out and just use the flag with the 4 provinces on it. And the Old English got involved and said no. So they all got, because the Protestants wanted to be represented, so that's why it's still in there. But that happened way before the Troubles. I mean, the irony is that the athletes in the north who play in all Ireland sports are quite savvy because they get the best of both worlds. They can get funding from UK sport and they get funding from the Irish Rowing Council. And they'll play that to the nth degree and get as much money as they can. Again, it's not religious. I mean, okay, the guys who play and compete in the north tend to be Protestant, and the people who compete in the south, the vast majority are Catholic. But it's really not a religious thing anymore, I don't think.
I'm sorry, my English is very poor. In the Asian Games happened the incident about the Muslim sport women wear different clothes or wanted to use different clothes. And what is coming? What is your opinion about that? What is coming in the future for the women in the sport and the Olympic Games and different games?
Of course, in 2012 Olympic Games were historic because it was the first time that all nations or delegations, they had women participating in sports. The last ones to send women to the Olympics were Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Brunei. I mean, and they happen to be all Muslim countries. But for the first time, there was a possibility. I mean, the international Olympic committees, national Olympic committees, and international federations came together to find some kind of possibilities to reconcile between the demands of some athletes to wear the veil and some of the demands of some conservative countries in the Arab world to allow for some kind of modifications on some of the rules, particularly with regards to women participation, and it happens for the first time that in 2012. But there are some federations that are still. There's the last one is the basketball federation that they don't allow the veil on the ground because of for safety reasons, and that's why, for example, the Qatari national basketball team, they will not. They forfeited from the Asian Games. That happens just recently because they were not allowed to have a veil. But maybe this will change as well. I mean, maybe the basketball federation then will have to sit with the International Olympic Committee to find other possibilities, because I think it's important. Because there are two issues. There's the arguments about increasing participation for and allowing creating an environment which is inclusive to different nations, different cultures within the International Olympic Committee, and there is the International Olympic Games, and there is also the issue of visibility of religion. Because for some there is they see it as rather than a religious practice, they see it more as a kind of a political, ideological kind of message, particularly the veil. Particular relation to the Iranian, for example, Iranian athletes who, when they come to the veil, maybe they are seen as more representing the Islamist or the Iranian political ideology. So there's this how to distinguish between a political ideology and the religious practice. I think that's they find it a little bit, particularly from a feminist point of view, in a Western secular context. The line between the two are still not clear for some, so that's what. But there is for women veiled athletes. For them, it's a way. It's emancipatory to have to have the possibility to choose to wear the veil and to be good at in sports. For them, it's something that it's emancipatory. But this emancipation discourse is not accepted by everybody. So yeah, there are still some tensions with regards to women participation in sport, but there are differences, within the whole Muslim countries. I mean, women participation in sport in some countries is not an issue, particularly those that have like a secular kind of tradition. But there are still in some other conservative or countries. I mean, there are still some tensions between how to reconcile between religious faith and the norms of international, sports, which for some is being seen as dominated by a Western culture.
Yeah, I had a question for Adrian, which was just about the coaching relationship and to what extent religion sort of enters into that, if at all, in your experience. And you mentioned that it's almost a non-issue in the sense people just one occasion they will just get on with it and have to manage the fasting issue. But because you're dealing with presumably team spirit and motivation and things like that, is it ever a sort of a thing you're conscious of?
Not really. I mean, particularly with someone like Mohammed, we helped him a lot. We got special sports scientists, nutritionists involved, so he could cope with the training. He wouldn't perform very well during the fasting period, but he could train properly. And it was never an issue. He just got on with it. It never had any consequence on anybody else. I suppose you can look back on someone like Chariots of Fire, Little refusing to run on a Sunday because of his religious beliefs. There were people that I've coached who are quite religious in what they do, but it doesn't impact at all. They never request anything because of it. The only thing that was different, I suppose, in Ireland was that we did have a bit, not a row, but a bit of a sort of difference of opinion with some of the athletes. A few of the guys were from a certain part of Cork, down the West Country, quite a few of them, and a little boy had been killed in a farming accident, and he'd been killed the day before a national trial up in Northern Ireland where we were hosting it, and a lot of the athletes wanted to go to the funeral. No, it wasn't him. It was one of the boys' fathers had died, and a lot of the guys knew him, and the girls knew him, and they wanted to go to the funeral, and we had to say to them they couldn't go to the funeral. This is a national team, we've got the whole country coming to perform, you're the leading athletes in this programme, you have to perform. You know, there was always in Ireland, and a month later there's the memorial. We let them off training for a day to go to that. But at that point we had to say to them, no, you have to come to, and they were quite upset, some of them, and they did it begrudgingly, not begrudgingly, but they did it and they understood the reasons. And they were upset, and to be fair, the boy was very good. He said, look, you can't help me by being there on that day. You can help me by being with me when I'm having a hard time in the weeks and months afterwards, because they all trained together. So it was the only time that we had some sort of had to put our foot down a little bit, and but it wasn't. I don't think that's religious, perhaps, but it.
So
in terms of segregation, but it is obviously a religious ceremony.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could ask a question which explores a bit more the motivation of the religious sportsman. I'm a Christian theologian who's very interested in work and also very interested in sport. And Christians often understand their occupation in terms either of calling or gifting. So they may have a strong sense of being called by God to do a particular sort of job. It might even be something they don't really want to do, but they feel called by God to do it. So that can be a strong motivation. Or they may feel they have a gifting, that God has given them a particular talent for doing something very well. And so that's the obvious thing that they should do. I just wondered whether there's something similar in Islam, whether Islam would use that sort of language, a language of call, a language of gift, or whether you would understand motivation in a rather different way.
I should first of all let's say that I'm no Islamic scholar in any way and nowhere near your level. So if anyone else in the audience is actually more equipped to answer that question, I'm more happy to allow them the floor if they're allowed to, of course. From what I know, which is very basic, I would describe myself as a practicing Muslim. The word da'wah in Arabic is to call upon. So for us, the word call is synonymous with our belief in God and the prophets and the angels and the books and the last day of judgment. It is very much part of our faith to actually we believe that as a Muslim, what is being blessed to you by God, which is the Islamic faith, which is something which is very close to you and sacred. It is because out of your love for the faith and out of the sacredness, you want to share that with others around you. So this is the concept, or my understanding of the concept of da'wah, which is to actually call upon others to the faith of Islam. And that could merely be by the fact of initiating a conversation, being able to answer some questions others may have of the Islamic faith. It could be, again, it could be literally, visually, you are calling upon Islam by actually not uttering any words whatsoever. Or the case that I'm putting forward is, these players actually are, in a way, participating in this call for Islam, or call for maybe to invite others to actually ask about Islam, not necessarily to actually go out on a mission to convert people. But on a mission, actually, which most of the players have actually brought up on several occasions, is the misconception of the Islamic faith. So I think this is a critical point here, that players actually find it quite beneficial that amongst their colleagues and staff, they're able to actually nurture that understanding of their faith and actually share that with people, with them. So of course, giving again, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is zakat. So charity is an integral part of giving. And in terms
it doesn't mean giving quite like that, but a gift in the sense of a talent, a special ability to do something well, which it's your responsibility to use. That's all right.
I mean, in that case, then knowledge, of course. Knowledge is something which is a must. If you are blessed with knowledge, you should share it with others. The most beneficial of you is the most blessed of you is those who are most beneficial to others, which is a hadith by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So I think, of course, in terms of knowledge, I suspect these players, again, they are actually self-claiming, I am a ambassador of the Islamic faith, I am a diplomat of the Islamic faith, you know, I speak on behalf of Muslims. There are many Muslim players in sports who actually, you know, go about their own ways. You know, they just turn up for football and playing, training, etc., and leave. Whereas others feel there's a duty upon them. So what you're referring to is maybe a responsibility on their part to actually share that their Islamic faith and understanding.
Yes.
There's all the praying and stuff that goes
Yes.
into footballers afterwards, and obviously Mahfoud does it
Yes.
after all his runs, but he doesn't seem to get much attention about it. Is that because it's not football and it's not in the press?
Yes or no. I think again, these symbolic acts, when they're performed, they are performed when there is success. And there's a very short-lived space of time for that. Instantaneously, if someone scores a goal, you lift up the shirt, and there's a message.
Yeah.
It could be R.I.P. So and so, but instantaneously, at moments of success, symbolism is most effective. So this is obviously theory. You know, the Pierre Bourdieu coined the term of symbolic power. So I think it's interesting to see that Mo Farah, of course, after, you know, let's say winning the race, for instance, Walker Straight, I think that was beamed out to millions of viewers. Obviously, 2012 Olympics, if not just around 1 billion viewers. But again, yeah, of course, obviously, in retrospect to sport, to football, sorry, there are a lot more viewers in that. But I wouldn't say. I think in the local Somali community, there's a lot more attention, obviously, because of Mo Farah. So there's a lot of the Somali youth actually look up to Mo Farah as someone. So he's Somali of ethnic origin, but obviously embraced the British identity, and you know, that they are proud to actually see him as a role model in that respect. But in terms of, I would just go by the Twitter reference. So just see how many followers Mo Farah has, compare that to another gold champion maybe in football. But I mean, yeah, it's very difficult to say one or the other has more or generates more awareness.
Yes.
I don't really know if this is going to make sense at all, because I've 10 it in my head to answer it. So let me just ask you the question. Could I please invite the panelists to tell us how the discourse about sport would have looked like in terms of continuity and interruption if Muslims had not become so visible in sports in this country?
I'll try and attempt to answer this question. Well, I mean, from a policy level, we can see that the government is spending a lot more on sport intervention programs, because they feel there is a need for. I mean, the idea of integration, for instance. You know, I think this is a very critical point from where I'm actually looking at it. There is an issue where the British government have said there's an issue of integration of British Muslims. We want to try and tackle this. How do we integrate more British Muslims in society? Now we can sit here and discuss what is the definition of integration, assimilation, etc., British Muslims, minority and majority, influxes. But I think what we're seeing here is the potential sport has to actually forge these links and these bridges between other faiths, and that's something which slowly they are capitalizing on. So I mean, there's a lot more funding now being dished out to faith-based organizations and interfaith organizations who are actually using sport now as a medium to actually invite others of different faiths to come together and join in these projects. If, let's say, Muslims were not, I mean, the number of Muslim football players were not as they are today in the Premier League, I don't think the documentary would have been made. I don't think the Man of the Match trophy would have changed. It would have remained the champagne bottle. I don't think many more multi-faith prayer rooms would have popped up. And I certainly don't think these fatwas would have come out as well for specific players who are actually going around and saying, my team is sponsored by 888.com. Gambling in Islam is forbidden. I cannot wear this T-shirt. And there are some cases where the Imam, for example, in Spain, with one particular case, allowed the player to actually wear the the shirt based on the fact that the company, through its halal so lawful earnings, they donate a certain amount of that towards charity. There are other cases where it is no, you cannot wear the shirt, and the club has actually accepted this fatwa and actually allowed Frederick Canuti again for one season to wear the same club shirt without the sponsor. So because they respected his religious belief in that sense. So again, I think we're seeing this more on an institutional level and at club level, where people are being much more open and receptive to the fact that, in particular, I speak on behalf of Muslims in this industry, and they're being much more accepting and allowing these changes to happen. Again, the intention behind that it could very well be, like I said, very simplistic in the sense that these are our employees. We must look after their needs and protect their space within this wider space. And it could ultimately be also that we are an all-embodying organization. We have many players across the globe, and we must respect the sensitivities and cultures and faiths of people in this industry.
Could I just, because my point perhaps wasn't very clear, I just wanted to talk about, wanted to ask you to speculate, to reflect on how the discussion today, your presentations today, would have looked like if Islam and Muslims were not visible in sports these days. It's not about what clubs have done.
Yeah.
Would have there been anything to talk about?
So in some countries or in some contexts, the question of visibility is not an issue because it's part of the diversity. So Muslims, they want also to be visible as other communities because they are also citizens of these countries and they have the rights to express their opinions. So therefore, visibility is not an issue. But then how we then will define visibility? For some, associating visibility with some religious kind of opinions, that's maybe this is not for some accepted, or it is seen as a kind of a sign of disintegration of the Muslim communities or ghettoization of the Muslim communities. And of course there are differences between European countries as well. When you say about visibility of religion, let's say in France, the way that is defined is not the same as, for example, in Britain, in a multicultural, where multiculturalism or cultural diversity is accepted as the norm. So I don't know why you think that visibility should be an issue.
My speculation is that if the Muslims have not become an issue, the question of sports and religion may not have come to the fore in the same way that we talk about it now, simply because the very fact that Muslims have become an element in sports somehow.
The one question I would have is that because obviously there's this big discussion between Islamic State and the religion, and they're not, they're sort of in parallel but not together. But for example, in America, baseball, a lot of Hispanics, a lot of Catholic symbolism, people praying and wearing them, kissing the cross before the bat and that kind of stuff, and it doesn't raise any press.
It might be an idea to think about it and answer Esther's question from the spectator's point of view. Like what's happened over 25 years. If you look at spectators looking in, when I was a kid going to football match, there was a lot of chanting that was racist. Right? That's gone. There's nothing to do with Islam. Now it's very much controlled in this country. Maybe in other parts you get it. But I wonder whether you might look at it in terms of like the spectator looking in on this sport compared to say 1975 or 74 to 2014, because the spectators looking in have changed dramatically in terms of what they're looking at and their chance, their participation in it, the language, they're being caught up in it, in terms of obvious issues such as prejudice.
I mean, that has to do with also the Islamic religious practice, which is, seems to be, and you don't wear the veil that maybe you look like European, or nobody will not have the visible kind of religion is visible in the public sphere. And
the main way that Jews themselves, and this would always come up in the there happened to be a Jewish player, is do you play on the holiest day or not, on Yom Kippur? Of course, the most by a Jewish athlete, nation of exposure and money. And with all due respect, that has so much to do with the fact that young men basketball, which is talked about here, because they realize that if they're able to develop themselves in a way all of his money, or lives a life of poverty despite the fact of making it. So I think that, we really have to deal with who is the ball and right handing, but in the whatever else. And we have a little country called China, where religion is not, but boy, is sport a big thing there as well. So I think that we really have to be careful and say, in terms of this idea of the money that comes from Sky Sports, this never existed before. I mean, a dream after they really have any chance to do it, because they have this, they have this. And there's a huge difference between recruitment and sports where that there isn't this kind of financial reward, whether it's hockey, rowing, lacrosse, so football, basketball, I think as a historian, these say to a certain why they're doing what they're doing. I mean, there might be a lot.
Especially in if these are allowed insofar as they are permitted within the general rules of society and politics. There was the news recently of a Newcastle player who has the second wife, and it is very, very badly criticized. But him goes.
This is Sheikh Tiote, who is from Ivory Coast, the central midfielder. Bar and Cisse. Now in Turkey, playing for Newcastle. When he's actually stopped prostrating. I don't know whether maybe that's because in the news he was caught gambling. Does it really affect? I don't think the club really. I mean, pretty much just put it this way: if Cisse was scoring 20 plus goals every year, getting Newcastle into the
Champions, the general perception.
Is it lawful to have a second wife?
Yes, it is. In this country, it is.
Maybe that's why.
Well, in that case,
I don't with this legal and illegal questions. I mean, this is
the first footballer to have more than one partner.
Just a very quick comment. There was a very well-known basketball Rodman who was a huge in his life, where he said that when you're good enough and you make it, you get to do whatever you do, and people don't. He said, which was great. He said, you wouldn't believe, the clothes in my size, that he's no problem. So he's other people doing.
Stop at 6:30. We have fruit juice and snack. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, that was good.